to the debate and on to our next topic. Thursday marked 2 months since the beginning of the so-called Occupy Wall Street movement in New York. Police dismantled what had become a sprawling tent city in Zuccotti Park, but the protesters wouldn't give up. They went on to demonstrate around the city, holding a huge mark on Brooklyn Bridge. And organisers have something of a mixed message. They say they're against alleged corporate greed, economic inequality and US foreign policy.
We go to the Middle East, be like, hey, we're going to spread democracy, and here we are, our government's suppressing democracy. It's just like, how much hypocritical can that get?
We rattled their cage, and now they're cracking down. We just got to show them that we're going to keep going on. The harder they push us, we're not going to break. We'll bend, but we won't break.
Christopher Dickey, do you have sympathy with these protesters who say they're against corporate greed?
Sure I do. I mean, I think that the disparity between the rich and everybody else in the United States is something that's become so pronounced now that it's just inescapable. And I think that the line that the Occupy Wall Street movement uses, that we are the 99% of the population that doesn't have most of the money, and we're against the 1% that's accumulated most of the riches and continues to accumulate more and more and more, I think that's very American. We're not an egalitarian society, but we don't like an environment where everybody is cut out while a tiny percentage of the population enjoys most of the riches of the nation. And I think that's a message that people respond to.
Craig Capitas, what's your take on it, on the Occupy Wall Street movement? They say, some of them say that they turned Wall Street into Las Vegas. I quite like that. Do you think they have a point?
There's so many cheap shots going back and forth on both sides of the political spectrum on Occupy Wall Street. I don't know if I can just reflect back for a minute. I remember a morning in the village of Qasr in Iraq, right after the invasion, and a bunch of village had been ravaged by Saddam, and a bunch of U.S. Navy guys came in, and they built from scratch the most beautiful playground for the children, all handmade out of wood, and everyone was standing around and they were clapping and applauding. The next day, it was gone. It had been vandalized. It had disappeared, and I wanted to find out what happened to this. And I found a guy who had all the wood and all the toys and stuff that was there in front of his hut. And I said, why did you do that? And he looked at me and he said, and this guy was actually an economist, believe it or not. He was one of Saddam's economists. He said, this is what people do when they have nothing. And I was always moved by that, because whether these people down there have iPhones and Apple computers and all this, as some of the commentators are saying, that they're being hypocritical, they don't see a future. I mean, that, to me, that's the reality here. And they're met with by politicians and a financial system that is really doing nothing to try and create and sustain a future for them. Just look at the gridlock in Washington. And that's left these people extremely frustrated. And I go back to my scene and I say, well, what he said, this is what people do when they have nothing.
Dave Clark, when you look at the protests, I don't think I've seen any banners or signs criticising the government specifically, which is quite unusual for a protest movement, isn't it? Usually people are angry and they take their anger out at the government. There's nothing directed at Obama here. He seems to have kept himself out of this. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think if they're not protesting against the government, then they're making a mistake. They're protesting against Goldman Sachs, but all Goldman Sachs people transferred directly to the White House and to the Treasury after the Obama victory. Right. This would offend everybody who's involved in those protests right now. But I see parallels with the Tea Party movement, and that it's about a frustration with an elite. Now, I think the responses of the left and the right to that problem would be very different. But the 99% also includes the Tea Party movement, and they don't see themselves being represented by the mainstream parties.
The Tea Party movement, one could say, has been a lot more successful in terms of getting people into power.
I mean, well, these people voted for the current government.
These are mostly Obama folks.
Yeah.
Right.
So their man is in power, and they don't see anyone working for them. I think that must be more frustrating than believing that one day, you know, when you finally put an evangelical Christian at the White House, that
And that's the common theme with
Mormon.
the indignados in Spain or the protesters in Greece. Very often they're people who actually voted for the centre-left governments, but they're facing a no future. More than 40% of young people in Spain unemployed. Same sort of figure in Greece.
In the UK, it hit 1 million young people this week without jobs.
Exactly, it's really stunning.
But in Europe, the protests seem to be more focused. They seem to have a more concrete list of demands. They're against the austerity measures, especially in Greece, and people are saying we can't possibly pay back this money on those terms. Get the EU out, get the IMF out. While as you look at these protests in New York and in London and elsewhere in the United States, it seems a lot more.
There's a tension in American society between the American dream, which says that I'm going to get rich someday, and the idea of egalitarianism, which says that, if I get rich, I should pay taxes. I mean, ironically, one reason that the Republicans still have traction on this idea of taxes, and let's keep taxes low, is not that it really helps the middle class. It doesn't. But people think, I'm going to get rich someday. And when I get rich, I don't want the government taking all my money.
Precisely. It's the great
That's a very American
perversion of the great
attitude.
American dream, right?
It's the American dream versus the American scheme. And that's what you're seeing taking place here. And I think that watching all of this, it's become, it was going to become politicized. But from afar as you watch this, I find it that the media has really failed to actually tell the public what they see there. These are confused young people and old people. And one other point on this, which as someone who was in school in the United States during the Vietnam days and saw my share of protests and people getting their skulls beat in, personally, I find it fascinating that the construction workers are down on the streets with them. The blue-collar people, because back in the anti-war days, they were the ones who were going out and doing the government's bidding, as we all remember, beating up the protesters. And that is fascinating, to have the unions on the street with these protesters.
It's quite a lot of veterans as well.
Yes. This is as significant in American terms as what happened here in '68, when the workers came out a little more violently.
Right, I was going to ask if you saw any parallels. With
a lot of parallels. It's the dynamic is the same. It's a parallel dynamic. It was different here in France in '68, but one of the fundamental elemental things of the protests here in '68 was that the workers came out with the students. That never happened in the United States. And that's what you're seeing here. Look at this, Verizon workers. You're seeing this, and as you said, the veterans as well.
But now they've been kicked out of their base at Zuccotti Park, where they had been for the past 2 months. The mayor says, Michael Bloomberg says, this can't go on. Do you think the movement's coming to an end, or do you think it will continue?
Well, I've not been to New York during these protests, and I must say, here in Paris, the protests have been pretty unimpressive so far. But I think this has legs. I think people will come back. I think they'll find a way. We were looking at images before. Today, we're seeing the Egyptians are back in Tahrir Square. I saw that back in February, and they thought they'd had a revolution, and now they're dealing with a military junta, and they're back protesting.
But it's very difficult for it's very difficult for authorities, though, isn't it, to balance the rights of the people who live and work in cities like New York with the rights of people to protest, because protests have recently taken on a very different style, haven't they? This is now about sit-ins that go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. There are health issues, there are hygiene issues. People living in tents in the middle of cities isn't always practical,
there are all
is it?
those kinds of things. It's a very difficult problem for the police and for the mayor, but particularly for the cops, because they're not fools. They realize that if they don't handle this right, they become the enemy. They become, in fact, the mobilizers of the protests, not the people who discourage them. And I don't think their record has been that great. There have been several incidents, particularly the one where you had one police inspector using pepper spray on 3 women. It was just ridiculous, just absurd. And they have tried to go gently, but at the end of the day, you're right. There are public health issues. There are issues of traffic. The people who got arrested yesterday on Brooklyn Bridge got arrested when they went out and tried to stop traffic. On the other hand, they get more publicity when they get arrested.
And Gandhi tried to stop traffic, and he was considered a hero. I mean, this is.
There wasn't so much traffic about them.
No, well, no. Look what he did. Look what he did down at the, with the salt. At the salt marshes. This has always been a real problem within the so-called movement in the United States, is they try They have always tried to bring in the peaceful demonstrations of Gandhi, use them, and it never seems to work out right. It's the one thing.
Well, the civil rights movement.
The civil rights was the exception. Excuse me. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
But Laura's also right about something she asked earlier, which is the whole question of the specificity of the demands. You can go on with this kind of generalized anger, we're mad as hell, we're not going to take it anymore, for a while. But ultimately, the reason you had 100,000 or more people back in Tahrir Square is they have specific demands. There's a specific law they want repealed. Yeah. This is what we're here for.
But what does that tell us? That tells us the confusion and the chaos that both within the people on the street and the government and the bankers who are trying to find a solution here. No one has a handle on anything. I think this is
Craig, are the bankers trying to find a solution to all these things? I mean, you and I know, we were talking about this earlier off camera.
Yeah. Is it the job of the bankers to find a solution?
But we all know people in business. We know that business is sitting on a huge amount of money in the United States, which it is refusing to spend because it says we don't know what the rules of the game are, it's insecure. They intentionally, not intentionally, they insist in many businesses now that if you're subcontracting with them, you are using a workforce in India or in South Asia, somewhere else in South Asia or Asia. Why? Because it's so much cheaper. It's a better use of your money. And basically, people feel they're getting screwed by this. And you know why? Because they are.
They are.
And there are things that can be done. And they can be done by legislation, and they can be done by political leadership.
But they don't know that in the crowd there. It goes back to this feeling of frustration. What I see here is an explosion of great frustration that no one sees a future. Many of these people here are lumbered with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, educational debt. They can't see past tomorrow. I'm not defending them, Chris, but I think it's asking a bit too much at this point for this group in Zuccotti Park to come in like the folks in Cairo and say, here is our list of demands to change.
All right, Craig, we'll have to leave that one there. I'm sorry, Paul, we're going to have to move on to our next topic because it's certainly a lot more dangerous to be a protester in Syria than it is in New York. There, the violence continued. Even after the country was kicked out of the Arab League this week, President Bashar al-Assad now has just hours to withdraw troops from towns and cities, or else he will face sanctions on his regime. Soldiers who have defected are growing by the day and scored a major victory this week when they attacked an intelligence agency near Damascus. Dave Clark, how much longer can this regime stay on?
Oh, it can stay on. They've attacked the Free Syrian Army, or whatever it's called, the new insurgency against Assad. It's attacked one intelligence headquarters and didn't overrun it. It was a great propaganda coup, not to demonstrate that you do have an armed opposition. But now it gets complicated. Now, if there's an armed opposition, it's going to have to take on the army, and it'll be crushed. And then who's going to intervene? Who's going to save the Syrian people then? Before, when there were unarmed crowds in the street, the sympathy around the world for them was immense. But if the country plunged into chaos, I spent a year in Iraq and. In 2006, 2007, and I am worried for the people of Damascus.
The Free Syrian Army, as they call themselves, these are soldiers who have defected. It is growing by the day, isn't it? It is getting stronger and it is getting arms. This is technically a civil war now, is it not?
Not yet, no. I don't think they're holding any territory. There may be pockets up by the Turkish border, but I think for it to be a civil war, you'd have to have two separate armed camps at the front line between them. I think what we've got here is the beginnings of a fight back from an oppressed and brutalized people, but I think some form of international intervention would be the only way to tip this now.
I think things have gone a bit further than Dave's suggesting. There are one or two pockets that are being held by opposition forces around Homs, around Deraa, and as you say, around the Turkish border. There are a significant number of defectors. We're talking thousands now of defectors from the army. They are, in some places, getting weapons and training. There is, I think, an increased risk of civil war. I don't know we'll be able to have a nice clean day where we can say, now it's civil war, but it won't be nice and it won't be clean if that day comes anyway. But I think that, I'm hearing the signs that there are weapons being smuggled into both sides, that there are Shia in Lebanon who are smuggling forces to their Alawite kin, and there are Sunnis who are smuggling in weapons to the Sunni defectors. But I think that the government forces are being sapped in a number of ways. The economy is being hit by sanctions. The morale of the armed forces, the number of reliable units that can still be turned out, both to deal with demonstrators and to deal with defectors, is shrinking. And I think over time, people in the opposition forces are talking about maybe 3 to 6 months. That may be wildly over-optimistic. I think all time frames for Syria so far have proved to be too short, but...
You're shaking your head, Christopher.
Well, first of all, there's so much we don't know. We don't know if this military group has any credibility at all. We don't actually know what happened at the intelligence headquarters. We don't have any witnesses there that are independent of the group. In the early 80s, when you really did have a civil war going on, then you had real carnage. You had things like the Ezbekiya barracks. Basically, the Pentagon in Damascus was blown up and scores of generals were killed. You had all kinds of things going on that are not going on now. We just don't know that much about what's going on in Syria, except that the protests continue, except that not Hafiz al-Assad, but Bashar al-Assad has not been able to control his own country. But that is a long way from saying that the regime falls. Because this regime, there is no end game for this regime except death.
Are you encouraged by the Arab League, Craig? Perhaps you want to answer that by what the Arab League did this week.
No, I think it's a toothless organization. It always has been a toothless organization. They're going to say one thing, and they're still going to support Syria. Chris is right. The regime's only outcome here, if they don't succeed, is death.
They either stay or they die.
Exactly.
That's quite an incentive to stay.
Yeah.
And they recently saw
friends.
how Gaddafi died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that will be
They
very
don't want
much in the
that.
forefront of their mind.
All right.
Also, we don't know the extent to which this rebellion is part of a proxy war in the region between the axis of resistance, the Hezbollah, Syria and Iran, and Saudi-backed powers. We don't know to what extent it's really...
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave there, I'm afraid. Dave Clark, Craig Kapitas, Paul Taylor and Christopher Dickey. Many thanks indeed to you all. That was The World This Week in conjunction with the International Herald Tribune. Thanks for watching, and until next week, goodbye.